Hello and welcome to College Bettas. Today we'll be looking at the Eco level. The Eco level comes in three sizes: small, medium, and large. The one that I am unboxing is a small. These are usually sold for $25, but I did get mine for free to use as a review. I do really like how it is made. It is made entirely of acrylic with screws. They are stainless steel. Stainless steel will not rust in an aquarium, but I did go ahead and cover up the screws with silicone, and you can also get plastic screws from the manufacturer. So these are the instructions for the Eco level. And this is the special message about getting the plastic screws. I went ahead and again stuck with the regular metal screws, but you can switch them out if you're worried about rust. So this is packaged very, very well. The first thing I pulled out were the 4 legs. This is one of the legs, and they are made of acrylic and have a place for the screw to go in. This is the tray portion that you put the dirt in, or the gravel, or whatever you want to keep inside of it. I used Eco Complete. So here's the fully assembled Eco level. I'm going to be putting it here on top of the craft mesh, and I'll be cutting the craft mesh to fit in the bottom portion of the Eco level so that I can tie yarn to the bottom and turn it into a fry saver. Many times breeders will use spawn mops to keep their fry safe, especially if they're being kept with the parents. In this case, I'd be keeping them with my bettas, so I want the fry to have a place that they can hide. So here I'm cutting out the places for the legs. That way it can fit nice and snugly up at the top. So the next thing I'm going to do is line up the craft mesh to make sure I cut it right, and I did. The only thing I went in and did later was make it a little bit smoother, so I did cut it a little bit smaller, but it didn't make much of a difference. So the next thing I'll be doing is getting the yarn ready. So I placed the Eco level to the side, and I'll be cutting a lot of strands of yarn. Now this is the yarn I'm using. This yarn is 100% acrylic, so it is safe to use in an aquarium, and it shouldn't degrade at all. I am using black because I originally got black for a different project, but I would personally probably use green if I was to make this in the future. So I measured it out by doubling it over of the length of the legs, and this ended up being a little too long, but you'll see how I trim that off later. So after cutting my first piece, I used the piece again to cut the new strands. And I continued to do this for about maybe 50 pieces. So this is about half the amount of string I used, because I ended up having to go through and make just as much again. So I'll be threading this into the craft mesh in 2 sides and then tying a knot. This was a little difficult because the yarn liked to separate, but if you had a yarn needle that you usually use with craft mesh and yarn, then it would work fairly well. I just don't happen to have one. In a later clip, you'll actually see a tissue box that is made the same way as these are made, that was made by my roommate's mom. So here I'm putting it in the other way. I usually left one square in between the two, but in other areas I did put 2 squares in between. So here I'm lining them up to make sure they are about the same, and now I'm just going to tie a knot to keep it up there at the top and so it won't move around. And I did do this multiple times. Again, it's probably about 50 pieces of yarn. It might have been less, I didn't ever count. So this is what it looks like, and it's going to be layered up a whole bunch. I would have liked to do more, but it was just very time consuming. So this is how many I ended up getting on there. As you can see, it's fairly densely done, but I think in the future if I was to do this again, I would make it even more dense, just so that there's even more places for the fry to hide. The yarn did kind of float up when I originally put it into the tank. So here I'm going to line it up so I can cut the strands. So as you can see, they're a lot longer than the legs, which I was not expecting. So now I'm just going to take my kitchen shears and cut across the yarn. You can use regular scissors for this. I just have kitchen shears that I use with my fish things just because there's a lot more hard plastic things that I need to cut, like when I'm cutting holes in tank lids and stuff like that, so I do have kitchen shears that I use with my fish. So after getting it sort of even, I'm now going to be siliconing the bottom on. This is aquarium sealant, but you can use other types of silicone as well. I just prefer to be safe and not do that, although it is fairly common to use regular silicone as well, as long as it doesn't have any additives and it is 100% silicone. So when you open the silicone, on the cap there's going to be a little raised section on the other side that you'll use to puncture the foil top. And the silicone started to immediately come out, so I ended up not putting on the extra tip that I'm holding in my other hand until a little bit later. So now I'm going to make just a few lines. I made 3 lines in the middle and then 1 line in between the 2 legs on the shorter end. And I did end up going around later and adding more to the edges so that it would sit a little bit more flush and wouldn't be so noticeable. I did cap it right away because my other silicone that I was going to use actually dried out. So here I'm just going to place it on top. And be careful about not getting too much silicone on yourself. I did end up getting a lot of silicone on my hands while I was gluing the rocks on, which is a little bit later. But I was able to figure out that using the more rough side of a kitchen sponge was able to get it off, you know, fairly easily. So here I'm going to start gluing on the rocks, and at this point I did put on the thinner spout because I wanted to be able to be a little bit more precise with the rocks, especially with the rocks that are very, very small. This just makes it a lot easier. So I did end up using a little bit bigger rocks at the very bottom of each of the legs, but you can use bigger rocks or smaller rocks. These rocks are from the dollar store, and I maybe used 25 or 50 cents worth of rocks, so it really is very cheap to do. You can also use rocks from outside, but you have to be careful about any fertilizers that you may use in your yard, and I would recommend boiling them or running them through hot water. I usually use hot water because I have no way to boil water except in the microwave. So here I'm just going to press the rock that's been siliconed for about 5 seconds. I ended up not doing this for very long just because none of the rocks seemed to fall off when I siliconed them, just because the silicone seemed to be strong enough. I was doing rocks very high up, closer to the top of the eco level, that weren't falling off, so I wouldn't worry about holding them on too much. This is very time consuming, but the more time you take, the better it's going to look. In some of the smaller cracks, I like to put the smaller rocks from the very bottom of the bag You can also use aquarium gravel for that, which was my original idea before I found all the little rocks. So I continued to do this for quite a while, but I did not film it. So this is how it ended up looking in the end. It is in Squirt's tank, and I did fill it up with Eco Complete and use some of my smaller plants. I do really like it, and Squirt seems to like it too. She loves going up into her little garden. If you can see above it, I did end up going and making another thing to go on top, and that is to keep the floating plants, which are Sylvinia minima, out of the way so those plants can get the most amount of light that's possible with my lights. I hope you enjoyed today's project. Please join us next week for another video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.